Book 4, Chapter 6, with 113 handwritten lines in the original language, is actually the longest chapter of Book 4. It is entitled, "On this, that he shall not be questioned for what he doeth, but all else shall be questioned." In this chapter, the Bab gets into a long and complex exposition on the authority of the manifestation of God and the identical reality of his revelation to that of him whom God shall make manifest. Unfortunately, it is beyond the scope of this course to examine in detail the Bab's brilliant commentary in this chapter of the Bayán of Farsi, so we will continue with the next chapter. Chapter 7 of Book 4, with 16 handwritten lines in the original language, is among the shorter chapters of Book 4. It is entitled, "On this, that the beginning is from God through him, and the return is to God through him." The opening sentence states, "The substance of this gate or chapter is that anything beyond God is his creation." No parts of chapter 7 has been translated by the Baha'i World Center, nor any parts of it has been discussed or are quoted by Dr. Saidi in his book. So we shall move on to chapter 8. In chapter 8, it is entitled, "On this, that by his verses he createth the tendency of everything as he desireth, and by it he nourisheth, causeth to die, and bringeth to life." So as you can see, it's a rather profound statement. I'll read that again. On this, that by his verses, by God's verses, he creates the tendency of everything as he desires, and by it he nourishes them, causing them to die or be brought to life. The Bab begins this chapter with this very mystical and abstruse exposition. He writes, "The substance of this gate is that all things return to man, and he is fashioned by 4 divine words: the word of creation, which is the truth of his heart; the word of provision, which is the truth of his spirit; the word of death, which is the truth of his soul; and the word of life, which is the truth of his body." And these are all attributes to the 19 souls who are the gates of paradise. "For whatsoever creation, provision, death, and life that occurreth, doeth so by virtue of the appearance of these manifestations." So as you can see, this is rather abstruse. Continuing on this, the Bab goes on to say, "For example, should one of the people of the Bayán offer a flower to a faithful believer, this deed is not but the very action of the letters of unity. For the soul that offers is the burgeoning of that unity, and he doeth this solely for the sake of obeying them. Thus not is seen in this deed but the action of God." Now, this is a section that Dr. Saidi in his book Gate of the Heart had translated. I personally didn't want to delve too much into it. As you can see, it has many layers and various nuances that can at least get me into trouble, exploring that, but it's very fascinating. Now, Nader has explained this somewhat in his book, so for those of you who are interested, you can refer to the Gate of the Heart with the references that I have given. So I've written here, "For further enlightenment or possible confusion on this passage and the mystical concept introduced by the Bab in this chapter, please see Dr. Saidi's Gate of the Heart, pages 293 to 298. So it's about 5 pages. It goes really extensively, and he explains it beautifully, but it is somewhat abstract. So again, for those of you who are interested, there you have that option. Moving on to chapter 9 of book 4, this chapter, with only 12 handwritten lines in the original language, is the third shortest chapter of book 4. There's no title to this chapter. It's very interesting, but a 2-line exordium in Arabic, which reads as follows. Let every owner of land who shall arise to espouse the Bayán write the mention of his name and that which God hath assigned to him from himself until the day when God shall again manifest the point of the Bayán, so that every soul may be recompensed with that which it hath acquired. Verily, he is swift in his reckoning, and verily, he is the all-possessing, the most exalted. So this is from again, this is my translation, but again, to show you that some of these chapters, they're very organic, and the Bab goes from, sometimes continues a theme, sometimes goes from one theme to another, sometimes goes from a very abstract exposition to a very direct law or exposition or injunction. So, and it's somewhat similar to what we see also in the Kitab Aqdas. The Kitab Aqdas, Baha'u'lláh himself, it says, it has been revealed in such a way that amazeth the minds of mankind. So it is quite a fascinating way of looking at the style and the delivery of these great sacred texts, especially in this revelation. Unfortunately, no parts of chapter 9 has been translated by the Baha'i World Center, nor parts of it, any parts of it rather, have been discussed or quoted by Dr. Saidi in his book. So what I have presented here should suffice as far as what in the opening lines of this chapter essentially states. Chapter 10 begins with these words. It is not permissible to teach any books other than the Bayán unless there be within those books something related to the knowledge of the word, ilm kalam. So the Bab continues and says the substance of this gate is that in this revelation, the Lord of the universe hath manifested within the point of the Bayán infinite revelations of unsurpassed knowledge and wisdom about anything and everything. So in a way, the Bab is saying that all that you need that should suffice you is already been revealed, or it's in this revelation. And also to bring the focus of humanity to the imminent advent of him whom God shall make manifest, we will see there are certain laws that are, as the Guardian says, they are very harsh and strict, which later on Baha'u'lláh has abrogated. For example, the law of burning of books. Every book should be burned. The Bab, we will see that, except the book of this revelation and the Quran, I believe he says, and it says, until the day of the advent of him whom God shall make manifest. So again, many of these laws have to be viewed within the context and under the premise that the Bab is refocusing the minds of humanity to this impending revelation of him whom God shall make manifest. Now, the Bab adds in this chapter 10 that God has made it unlawful for anyone to engage in such fields of study, and he actually, recounts what they are. Principles of Islamic law, usul fiqh, logic, mantiq, jurisprudence, qawaid fiqhiyeh, philosophy, qawaid hikmiyeh, science of languages that are no longer in use, ilm lughat غیر مستعمله, and the like, he goes on to say, as also what has been written on Arabic grammar and syntax, as sarf wa nahw, which is in Arabic, obviously, he states that one may learn just enough Arabic grammar to understand the Bayán, even though there have been revealed in this revelation enough Persian verses that should suffice most of the people. So in a way, the Bab says that you don't. This goes back to the concept of the two languages of revelation. There is so much versatility that as much as you're going to miss on some if you, for example, only know Arabic and not Persian, and vice versa. That he says that there is enough that will suffice, and this is why. He's revealed a shorter version, an abridged version of the Bayán in Arabic, even though there are some parts of the, as was pointed out by some of the friends, that there are parts of the Arabic Bayán that include stuff that is not in the Persian Bayán, and also vice versa. There is many parts of the Persian Bayán that is not in the Arabic Bayán. But again, the Bab says that what has been revealed is enough, for them. And I've always, have held this belief based on the encouragement that I got as a young student of the Baha'i sacred text. One of the great Persian scholars who I had the privilege of meeting, and he's now passed away, when I inquired about what should I do or where should I start with the writings of the Bab, he actually mentioned to me that start with the Persian Bayán and Dala'il Sab'eh, the seven proofs, which is actually a shorter, revealed in the same period, but it's one of the most cogent and very coherent works of the Bab that was revealed, I believe, in the honor of one of the great exponents of the Bábí revelation, Hujjat Zanjani. So, there is enough. He says that we could, we could content ourselves, and so he is again bringing many of the newly new adherents of the new believers of the new faith who come from a very extensive Shia and Islamic background, that he wants them to abandon what they had learned and really focus their attention on his revelation and on the words, that these new words that have been revealed. So again, telling them that they should stop studying principles of Islamic law, logic, jurisprudence, philosophy, all the stuff that can make them overthink things, and really miss the boat on the essentiality of what this revelation is all about. And I think that you will see that there's lots of warnings in the Bab's writings, especially in the Bayán, with his followers, where he admonishes them and not to do what, or commit the error that committed by the Muslims in general for failing to recognize their promised one, namely himself. And he is preparing the way in such a way for the advent of Baha'u'lláh, or him whom God shall make manifest, so that there is absolutely no shadow of doubt that who he is. And you're seeing that, there's so many indirect references by the Bab, and almost direct references, but subtle, to Baha'u'lláh. Even he mentions his name, and so again, we need to look at this, all these injunctions, within that spirit, that the Bab is trying to divert the attention of people from other things that are distracting them, and refocus their attention back to the essentiality of what this revelation is all about. Now, later in chapter 10, the Bab boasts again about the remarkable and unprecedented prowess invested by God in his revelation. He writes, God hath conferred upon him such power and speech that if a proficient and speedy amanuensis could write without pause and with the utmost speed the equivalent of a single Quran would stream forth from his lips in matter of 2 days and 2 nights. A Quran with such verses that even if all the learned men on earth gathered together, they would still be powerless to comprehend the meaning of a single verse of it. Wow, it's quite a testimony to his revelation. So these excerpts that I just shared with you in chapter 10 here have not been previously translated, and I don't believe Dr. Saidi discusses that in his book. That is correct. So book 4, chapter 10 consists of about 45 handwritten lines in the original language. It's one of the more important chapters, in my opinion, of this book 4. But unfortunately, no parts of it has been translated by the Baha'i World Center, nor any parts of it has been discussed or quoted by Dr. Saidi in his book. So therefore, what I've offered you should give you some insights into the main theme of this great chapter of book 4. Moving on to chapter 11. Chapter 11 begins with these words: whosoever oversteps the limits imposed by the Bayán shall not be deemed a believer, no matter what station he may occupy, a learned, a king, a vassal, or a servant. So the Bab says that, I mean, it's very clear. He says, you have to adhere strictly to the laws, no matter who you are, whether you're a king, learned, or someone of low rank. Doesn't matter. In the sight of God, all are equal. And then he goes on, says, the substance of this gate is that God, at the time of the revelation of the Bayán, hath considered all his creatures and fixed limits for each of them, regardless of their rank and file, so that no one shall be in the least grieved or despondent in the paradise of the Bayán. Beautifully said. He then continues by stating, for he hath ordained, God hath ordained, that whoever possesses power over anything must elevate it to its uttermost perfection, that it not be deprived of its own paradise. For example, the paradise of a sheet of paper on which a few excellent lines are inscribed is that it be refined with patterns of gold illumination, adornment, and excellence that are customary for the most exalted parchment scrolls. Then the possessor of that paper hath elevated it into its utmost degree of glory. And I have to tell you this is magnificent. And you're going to see this with the Bab talks about the fine script. We discussed it last time. He also talks about illuminating pages, and this is something that the heads of the faith have, particularly after Baha'u'lláh, Abdul Baha and Shoghi Effendi, have done this. In fact, I may have mentioned that the beloved guardian in the 1930s brought a gentleman, Mr. Mohibat from Iran, who was a master illuminator, and he worked for a number of months at the Baha'i World Center in the Holy Land and illuminated many of the works of Baha'u'lláh. Many of the tablets the guardian gave him to be illuminated. And they're beautiful. You can see them in the International Baha'i Archive. Some of them have the House of Justice for special occasions, have sent facsimile copies, photographs of them to be published in books. The guardian himself would send an illuminated text as a blessing to the various national conventions. I know he did that with the U.S. National Convention on several occasions, and there's actually a story about that some of it eventually found its way to one of the local assemblies, and I visited that assembly or that Baha'i center. It was in Berkeley, California, And as I walked in, I noticed a tablet of Baha'u'lláh, beautiful illuminated tablet. Most of the friends didn't know it was actually a tablet in the handwriting, and an original one. So I suggested to them to consult with the Baha'i World Center, and the Baha'i World Center requested that they return that to the World Center because it is for it to be preserved. So it's again, it's very fascinating here that the Bab really emphasizes that, and he himself beautifully adorned even some of the letters that he would write to the letters of the living, as you've seen in the opening pages of the Dawnbreakers. They're done on such very special paper and with great care. There is no scratches or corrections. This is again marvelous. And then we're going to talk about later on the script that in this revelation has been adopted as the official script of the revelation, which is very unusual as far as the in the Arabic and Persian text. So, but that's something that's coming up in the next few books. So here, essentially, the underlying point here is about excellence, the excellence in all things. And here, the Bab says that the excellence of that piece of paper, by adorning it, can be fully realized, and its paradise can be established if the effort has been made to perfect that. So we must. What I get from this chapter, that we must all aspire for perfection. We may never reach it as individual creatures, but we must aspire for perfection in all our endeavors, in all our ways. So here the Bab is encouraging his believers as well to do that. And continuing with that, the Bab states, should the individual know of a higher degree of refinement and fail to manifest it upon that paper, he would deprive it of its paradise, and he would be held accountable and would be asked, why hast thou, despite the possession of the means, withheld the effusion of grace and favor? I also see this, as somewhat another layer of it, is that in many human endeavors, if we have the way and the means to achieve a good service to humanity, in the way of, for example, eradicating starvation and poverty in the world, which the first world nations of today, there's enough wealth that we can, but obviously they don't want to. They don't feel that it is their duty or responsibility, and yet in the sight of God, it is. When one has a more of a global view of what humanity and the condition of humanity is, that majority of the world are actually they're living below par. And it's only in the Western world that we're blessed to have the means of living at such a high standard, but majority of the world don't. So I read into this as well, that one of the dimensions that it speaks to me personally is that the potential of the highest level of excellence is if it's there, we must, as individuals, do everything within our power to bring it about, to manifest it, rather than withhold it. And this goes back to the generosity of people, amassing wealth and then dying, and and not using their material means to serve humanity. Because the highest level, as Baha'u'lláh has also stated in his writings, the highest level that any human being can reach is a station of servitude, is the station of service to his fellow men. So therefore, everything, all resources should be used in that service. Obviously within reason and moderation, but at the same time, if someone has millions of dollars, there's no point in just keeping them in a bank and stocks and all that. Again, this is just something that I read into the words of the Bab here, and also we all experience that in our reflections in the writings of Baha'u'lláh as well. So this excerpt was from The Gate of the Heart, but it's also I've done some tweaking on the translation. Some of them you'll see if you go back to them. So chapter 11 consists of about 50 handwritten lines in the original language. No parts of this chapter has been translated into English by the Baha'i World Center, but certain sections of it have been quoted and discussed by Dr. Saidi in his book. Moving on to chapter 12 of book 4, it is entitled "On that all shrines of bygone dispensations must be removed from the face of the earth." Ooh, this definitely could be controversial. Again, this is a refocusing of the Bab, of the people, by the Bab to the people, that they should be focused on the now and not the past. So this chapter consists of about 30 handwritten lines in the original language. Just under 1/3 of this chapter has been translated into the English by the Baha'i World Center, and the translated passages are following this slide in a chronological order. So here's the passage, the first passage. The Bab writes, "Thou beholdest how vast is the number of people who go to Mecca each year on pilgrimage and engage in circumambulation, while he, through the potency of whose word, the Kaaba, the sanctuary in Mecca, hath become the object of adoration, is forsaken in this mountain. He is none other but the apostle of God himself, inasmuch as the revelation of God may be likened to the sun. No matter how innumerable its risings, there is but one sun, and upon it depends the life of all things. It is for this reason that in every revelation, the succeeding manifestation of God is more exalted than the previous one." I just added this line in bold yellow to differentiate it from the excerpt that has been officially translated by the Baha'i World Center. So at the end of this passage, the Bab says, "It is for this reason that in every revelation, the succeeding manifestation of God is more exalted than the previous one, because their revelation is more exalted." Continuing on this note, the Bab says, "It is clear and evident that the object of all preceding dispensations hath been to pave the way for the advent of Muhammad, the apostle of God. These, including the Muhammadan dispensations, have had in their turn as their object the revelation proclaimed by the Qa'im," meaning his own revelation of the Bab. "The purpose underlying this revelation, as well as those that preceded it, has in like manner been to announce the advent of the faith of him whom God shall make manifest," namely the Baha'i revelation. And the Bab continues, "And this faith," that is the faith of him whom God shall make manifest, "in its turn, together with all the revelations gone before it, have as their object the manifestation destined to succeed it, and the latter, no less than all the revelations preceding it, prepare the way for the revelation which is yet to follow. The process of the rise and setting of the sun of truth will thus indefinitely continue, a process that hath had no beginning and will have no end." So this concept of progressive revelation that we see so beautifully enunciated by Bahá'u'lláh in the Kitab-i-Iran is, in fact, has been previously introduced by the Bab in the Persian Bayán so eloquently and so beautifully as well. So again, Bahá'u'lláh has expounded on that and has perfected it, if you will. But here the Bab is, you will see that the theme of progressive revelation is very ubiquitous in the Bayán itself. Now, in conclusion of this passage, the Bab writes, well is it with him who in every dispensation recognizes the purpose of God for that dispensation and is not deprived therefrom rather, by turning his gaze towards the things of the past. And this section has been translated in selections from the writings of the Bab, passage number 34. Okay, moving on to chapters 13, 14, and 15. Now, the central theme of chapter 13, 14, and 15 are the same as chapter 12. In these chapters, the Bab elaborates further on the concepts of shrines for mass worship and the necessity and elimination of past so-called holy shrines, with the exception of those of central Islamic figures such as the Prophet Muhammad and his family. Now, I want to again bring this into context for those of you who perhaps are from Iranian heritage. You will recall that in Iran, and still today, there were a lot of these very small shrines, or these what they were called Imamzadeh, were basically descendants. They were shrines of the descendants of, let's say, a great figure, and they are. There's a very large number of them throughout Iran, and they became the focus of that region's worship. So in some way, the Bab is saying, you know what, you need to refocus your attention on the central shrine, or the most important. So when he's talking about the elimination, particularly in Islam, the elimination of all these superfluous shrines, with the exception of the main shrines, the shrines of, for example, of Mecca, the grave and the shrine of Fatima, the grave and shrine of all the holy imams, the 11 of them there. That there is one of them, Imam Reza, that's in Mashhad. He, I believe, is the 10th Imam, I believe. I may be wrong, 8th or 10th Imam. And then there is quite a number, a handful of them in Iraq, and the remaining of them are in Saudi Arabia, between Mecca and Medina, where some of the Imams have been buried. Fortunately, no parts of either chapter 13, 14, or 15 have been translated by the Baha'i World Center, nor any parts of them have been discussed or quoted by Dr. Saidi in his book. Chapter 13, 14, and 15 each consists of various lengths, 21 lines, 45 lines, and chapter 15 is actually only 5 lines, makes it the shortest chapter of book 4. Moving on to chapter 16. Chapter 16 is entitled "In Description of the Holy House." Now, the Bab, in the opening lines of this chapter, writes, "The substance of this gate, or chapter, is that from everlasting there hath never been a specific place on earth for God, nor will there ever be. In each revelation of his divine will, whatever place he hath chosen to associate with himself, that place hath become his house, and the place of worship and circumambulation of the peoples of the world, and the concourse on high." So this is very special, and in fact, it speaks volumes to the so-called house of God in Mecca, which I'm going to explain in just briefly. So the place that is associated with that revelation, that becomes the house of God. The term used in Islam to refer to that cubical structure in Mecca, that shrine, as the house of God. And for those of you who are familiar with Islamic history, that that edifice was there prior to Prophet Muhammad. In fact, it used to house idols, various idols. And the Prophet went, based on Islamic history, in there and cleansed that edifice, that shrine, from all idols, and then made it this house for the worship of one God, one true God. In this revelation, the houses that have been associated with the Bab and Baha'u'lláh, which both of them, unfortunately and sadly and tragically, have been destroyed. The house of the Bab in Shiraz, very tragically destroyed by the enemies of the faith. And in recent times, as you all heard through the announcement of the Universal House of Justice in the last couple of years, that the house of Baha'u'lláh in Baghdad, which is known as Baytullah as well, the house of God, and has the rites of pilgrimage. In fact, the Hajj in the Baha'i faith is to these two locations, the house of the Bab in Shiraz and the house of Baha'u'lláh in Baghdad. That is the Hajj. What we go on pilgrimage to the Baha'i World Center to visit the shrines of the Bab and Baha'u'lláh are not actually the Hajj in the sense, in the terms as defined by Baha'u'lláh, even though it is a very sacred place and is a place of pilgrimage, and it's the qibla of the and point of adoration of the Baha'is, but yet the Hajj were related to these two houses that have been destroyed. So obviously in future they would have to be rebuilt and reconstructed and set up in such a way that the faithful could perform their rites of pilgrimage. Chapter 16 consists of about 78 handwritten lines in the original language, making it the third longest chapter of book 4. Unfortunately, no parts of it has been translated or discussed by Dr. Saidi or the Baha'i World Center. Well, actually, there has been. Okay, so there is a section of it. I may have accidentally copy and paste that one there. So this is a section that has been translated by Dr. Saidi in his book. So yes, so it states, this is the fruit of pilgrimage. So this is from the Persian Bayán, chapter 16. This is the fruit of pilgrimage, that they may arise to fulfill his command, that happily in the day of his revelation, by the aid of such an approach, they will ascend toward him. Alas, for the dispensation of the Quran, no such fruit is harvested, inasmuch as while 70,000 souls circle round that house, at this very time, the supreme source of the sanctity of the house resides within the mountain of Maku. Yet, except for one soul, none is present before him. You know, the irony of all of this, the Bab talks about that, you know, there's 70,000 people are circumambulating this edifice, and yet they should be circumambulating the Bab and his house and the place associated with him. And yet, ironically, not only he has been banished to a remote prison on a mountain, but there's only one person. There's not even his faithful are allowed to circumambulate him. Just one person, and it's a reference to one of the letters of the living Sayyid Husseini Yazdi, who was the Bab's amanuensis and companion through his imprisonment at Maku and later on Chehrid. The passage continues, it is evident that the fruit is not yet gathered. The Bab says, in truth, it would have been more befitting that at the time of the revelation, meaning his revelation, all the faithful believers in the Quran, who by virtue of his command circumambulate so frequently around a mere piece of dust, circumambulate infinite times and until the end that hath no end, around the command of his own self, meaning about the Báb. So again, this is a very sad irony that the Báb is exposing here in this chapter, chapter 16 of book 4. Another excerpt that Dr. Saidi has translated from this chapter follows in these words: guard yourselves, the Báb writes, that ye may not in any way be the cause of sadness to another soul, inasmuch as the hearts of the faithful are nearer to God than the house made out of clay. Now, this reference to not bringing sadness to the heart of an individual will later on, there is a law associated with that, where if you bring sadness to the heart of a soul or break someone's heart, there is a monetary reparation that has to be made to the head of the faith, not to the individuals. It's very interesting. It's not to the individuals, but to the head of the faith. And you're going to see that as well. And this is something that also Bahá'u'lláh has made a commandment in the Kitab al-Aqdas. However, he has forgiven the monetary penalty of it. Baha'u'lláh says that you just have to ask forgiveness from God, but you know, he does talk about that in the Kitab al-Aqdas, and we'll look at that law of the Aqdas, which is very special as well, which is essentially the echo of what the Báb is talking about. So, but here he's talking about, you know, and you're going to see he's going to make reference. I believe Nader has translated this part, the experience that the Báb himself underwent during his own pilgrimage, and he saw people, you know, engaged in insults and acts that was unworthy of a pilgrim, and the Báb gives that as an example, and then uses that as a case study, if you will, for what not to do. So he says, guard yourself that ye may not in any way be the cause of sadness to another soul, inasmuch as the hearts of the faithful are nearer to God than the house made out of clay. However, nothing is more important in the path of pilgrimage than the adornment with virtuous conduct, so that should he be in the company of another, neither he himself nor his companion should have the cause for sadness. So he says, if you're going to go on a pilgrimage, what's the purpose of pilgrimage? You're there to fulfill a rite prescribed by your Lord. So you must be devoted. You must, you know, this is a spiritual act. So be spiritual. You know, have a virtuous conduct, you know, in that process, which makes perfect sense. But unfortunately, that's not the case, even today. Sorry, I'm just going back to this here. I'll just delete this. Accidentally pressed another button. So in the next paragraph in this chapter, chapter 16, the Báb recounts the event of his own pilgrimage. He says, I have observed on the way to Mecca acts which, in the sight of God, are of the vilest kind, sufficient to undo the good that results from the act of pilgrimage. These were the quarrels among the pilgrims, for quarrels are forbidden at all times and under any condition, and the ways of the faithful have never been nor will ever be aught but forbearance, patience, humility, and serenity. So the Báb enumerates these 4 virtues, these 4 qualities that one must have, especially when one sets out on pilgrimage to sacred locations in general. He says a pilgrim must be forbearing, must be patient, must be humble, and must be serene and peaceful. Verily, the house of God hath no need of such people. He basically says, if you're going to be like that, just don't come. don't bother, because that's really that's going to completely undermine the whole purpose and the premise by which a pilgrimage was designed by God for the faithful. He then continues, it behooves the sovereign of the kingdom, and he talks about what kings must do, who are the king of particularly the land wherewith the shrines or that special place is. And you're going to see that in future it's going to be also Tehran as well. We're going to come back to that as well, the place, the land of the birth of him whom God shall make manifest. So the Bab continues, it behooves the sovereign of the kingdom wherein liveth the sacred house of God. Indeed, it behooveth all kings to establish offices in every part of their territories to disseminate the news and correspondence within that land from one end to the other. In the West, such a system is organized in the utmost excellence, whereby the current news, which otherwise can take several months to arrive, is received within a short time. Perhaps he's talking about the telegram. And in the 1840s here, some of that had not really been implemented in the Middle East, whereas the West, particularly Europe and North America, parts of North America, these technologies were being used. However, it is befitting that the king make this accessible to all, that all can be informed of the news swiftly. And then he continues, for he whom God shall make manifest will assuredly be manifest, and should the means of receiving news and books are prevalent among all, the servants of God will attain the blessing of guidance more speedily. Where one to hear the news of the revelation earlier to the extent of an infinitesimal part, a ninth of a ninth of a tenth of a tenth of a moment, become aware of his appearance and recognize him, it would be better for him than to be the possessor of all that is on earth and offer it in the path of God. So again, these channels of communication, opening using technology, the Bab says should be used because if the news of the advent of him whom God shall make manifest reaches one group and the other groups are unaware of it, they would be deprived. So when he appears, everyone should know almost simultaneously through these technologies of communication. So this type of telecommunication, if you will, and obviously today we have the internet, we have the we're living in the information age, but in that time it was still a bit of the horse and buggy carrying the news, the letters, and so on and so forth. So again, in anticipation of the advent of the new revelation of him whom God shall make manifest, the Bab is encouraging the authorities to also get updated for the sake of everyone, in the service of everyone. And he continues, I think this is the last passage translated by Dr. Saidi in his book regarding this concept of pilgrimage. The Bab continues, it is for this reason that such an ordinance is decreed, that happily in the day of the revelation of the most mighty day star, referring to him whom God shall make manifest, to Bahá'u'lláh, the means to facilitate the attainment of the glory of guidance for his servants will be prepared. However, until such a system is made universal, its benefit will not reach those servants of the kingdom unless there come a time when it will be accessible to all the people. Although today the kings have their own special couriers, this is fruitless, for the poor are deprived of such a service. All right, moving on to chapter 17. Chapter 17, with only 7 handwritten lines in the original language, is the second shortest chapter of Book 4. The theme of this chapter revolves around the same subject matter as chapter 16, which dealt with various aspects of the house of God. Unfortunately, no parts of chapter 17 has been translated into English by the Baha'i World Center, nor parts of it have been discussed truly by Dr. Saidi in his book, particularly regarding this. So these are various elements that the Bab introduces with regards to pilgrimage and various other things. So again, many of those have been now updated in this revelation, and they have been superseded, by the Baha'i revelation. So, Book 4, Chapter 18 is comprised of 73 handwritten lines in the original language. About 1/4 of this chapter has been translated by the Baha'i World Center into English, and here are the translations in a chronological order. The Bab writes in chapter 18 of Book 4, 1270 years have elapsed since the declaration of Muhammad, and each year unnumbered people have circumambulated the house of God. In the concluding years of this period, he who is himself the founder of the house went on pilgrimage, a reference to himself, the Bab. Great God, there was a vast concourse of pilgrims from every sect, yet not one recognized him, though he recognized every one of them, souls tightly held in the grasp of his former commandment. The only person who recognized him and performed pilgrimage with him is the one round whom revolved 8 Váḥids. This is a reference to Quddus, Mullah Muhammad Ali Barfurushi, who is one of the letters of the living and one of the most exalted figures in the Bábí dispensation, in whom God hath gloried before the concourse on high by virtue of his absolute detachment and for his being wholly devoted to the will of God. This is very special, the way the Bab explains the station of Quddus, and Dr. Saidi in his book, page 285, also explains about what and elaborates a little bit further on Quddus. But what I found very fascinating, remember, Quddus was one of the youngest of the letters of the living, and yet he was elevated to such a high rank. In fact, he was elevated in a rank higher than Mullah Hussein, that in the fourth of Sheikh Tabarsi, the commander, the lead commander, was Quddus. And even though Mullah Hussein was much more senior than him, at least by about 10 years in age, yet through the instructions of the Bab, Quddus was to be obeyed by everyone, including Mullah Hussein. But the part that shows here for me was very fascinating is that it's through the Bab that Quddus became Quddus. That it was true, it was this station was conferred on him because of his detachment, because of his devotion, and because of his sacrifices, that he had made. If you will recall in the Dawnbreakers, him and another faithful believer, the father of one of the first hands of the cause, Ibn Astaq. So Ismullahul Astaq, we have a wonderful biography of him in the Memorials of the Faithful, as well as Mr. Balyuzi. The first chapter of Eminent Baha'is at the time of Bahá'u'lláh talks about Ismullahul Astaq. Ismullahul Astaq was one of the students of Sayyid Kazim as well, and he became a believer in the Bab soon after. I think he was in the next group of believers after the Letters of the Living, and he remained very faithful to the Bab. He fought at the fort of Sheikh Tabarsi, survived it, and then became a devoted follower of Baha'u'lláh in Baghdad. He was an incredible soul, absolutely incredible soul, one of the great heroes of our faith. I mean, his name just speaks that the name of God, the most truthful. That's the title that he was given, and had you know, the head of this eminent family, the Astaq family, of the that his son was the hand of the cause, and both him and his son were never actually martyred, but they were living martyrs, because Baha'u'lláh refers to the hand of the cause as Ibn Astaq as Shahid, Ibn Shahid, the martyr, son of martyr. And just true incredible through their devotion, through their dedication. So here the Bab talks about that the only person that truly recognized him, you know, the Bab handpicked Qudus to go on pilgrimage with him. Out of all the letters of the living, he deputized them. You know, he sent Mullah Hussein, he sent Mullah Ali Bastami to Baghdad, and sent Mullah Hussein to Tehran, and then he basically singled out Qudus to come with him on pilgrimage to Mecca. So here we need to look at it within that context of that the Bab recreated Qudus from Mullah Muhammad Ali Barfurushi. So here the Bab says the only person who recognized him and performed pilgrimage with him is the one around whom revolve 8 Váḥids, in whom God hath gloried before the concourse on high by virtue of his absolute detachment and for his being wholly devoted to the will of God. This doth not mean that he was made the object of a special favor. Nay, this is a favor which God hath vouchsafed unto all men, yet they have suffered themselves to be veiled from it. So he basically says that others could have achieved the station that Qudus achieved, but they were not there. You know, the potentiality was there. He could have crowned them with that special honor as he did with Qudus, but they were not. They did not recognize him. So hence Qudus was elevated to such a high rank. So I find that this passage is very telling of that as human beings, we all have the potential to be great, and our greatness is a function of how much we serve the cause of God. And you see that in the lives of the hands of the cause of God, or the members of the Universal House of Justice, people who sacrifice so much, who rise to serve the cause, and with tremendous devotion, and with selflessness, with humility, and then they become the recipient of God's grace through, you know, being appointed the hand of the cause and so on. They're ordinary individuals, but they're elevated to that rank based on their devotion and their service, where the Bab talks about the Qudus here as well. Then the Bab continues the commentary on the Surah of Joseph, Qayyum al-Asma, had in the first year of this revelation been widely distributed. Nevertheless, when the people realized that fellow supporters were not forthcoming, they hesitated to accept it, while it never occurred to them that the very Quran, whereunto unnumbered souls bear fealty today, was revealed in the midmost heart of the Arab world, yet to outward seeming, for no less than 7 years, no one acknowledged its truth except the commander of the faithful, Imam Ali. This is in Islamic history, in the early years of Muhammad's revelation, only very handful, and for a long time, it was you know, Ali, his cousin, who later became his son-in-law, but he was his father's brother's son, and who became very devoted to Prophet Muhammad. and his wife, obviously, Khadija. And for many years, and again, you read passages in the Quran that Muhammad was reluctant to go out and even teach the cause, because they would pelt stone at him, they would spit at him, they would call him names, and he struggled. He basically struggled for that first few years, and that his message was not embraced. And then through the efforts of Ali and obviously the Prophet himself, slowly individuals embrace the cause of God. But the Bab here talks about that he says, you guys have no courage here. Only the people who were courageous, who came, and despite the consequences of their actions, being ridiculed, being oppressed, they won themselves this immortality of being remembered by God in the annals of his faith as these early dawn breakers, if you will, the breakers of the dawn, as the Guardian puts it. So here he gives the example that no less than 7 years, no one acknowledges truth except the commander of the faithful, Imam Ali. May the peace of God rest upon him. The Bab continues, just reading that sentence. It's a long sentence about the commander of the faithful. And then, in response to the conclusive proofs advanced by God's supreme testimony, recognized the truth and did not fix his eyes on others. Thus, on the day of resurrection, God will ask everyone of his understanding and not of his following in the footsteps of others. How often a person, having inclined his ears to the holy verses, would bow down in humility and would embrace the truth, while his leader would not do so. Thus, every individual must bear his own responsibility rather than someone else bearing it for him. There is an excerpt in the Gleanings from a passage from a tablet, I believe is Lohin Nasir, but again, don't quote me on that, but it is in the Gleanings. You guys can look it up. It's a marvelous passage where Bahá'u'lláh, and I'm paraphrasing here, says that everyone is responsible for their own faith. And if an individual, again, I'm paraphrasing, if an individual, when he passes on and is brought before his maker and is asked the question, why did you not believe? And if the individual's answer was, oh, just because all the people around me did not believe, so therefore me following their ways, I also did not believe, God, it would not be acceptable in the sight of God, Baha'u'lláh says, because every individual will be responsible for their own faith. You know, at the Guardian, there's a very, very famous excerpt from one of his letters. It says that we are only responsible for one soul and one soul alone in this world. You know, when talking about even in our marriage, in our marital life, you know, within our family, all of that, those are association. But ultimately, we're only responsible for one soul and one soul alone. I always say we come alone, we go alone, you know. So again, here, this is underscored and underlined here by the Bab. In the next passage after this, the Bab continues, at the time of the appearance of him whom God will make manifest, the most distinguished among the learned and the lowliest of men shall both be judged alike. How often the most insignificant of men have acknowledged the truth, while the most learned, and I want to add most powerful, have remained wrapped in veils. Thus, in every dispensation, a number of souls entered the fire by reason of their following in the footsteps of others. Some of you who have taken some of my trainings or courses on the revelation of Baha'u'lláh and Baha'u'llah's proclamatory letters to the kings and rulers, I think this is definitely the echo of that some of the great kings and rulers of the time chose to ignore Baha'u'llah's message and entered the fire by reason of their following in the footsteps of others or being vain and arrogant and not taking the heed, the divine call for their own good. Anyhow, moving on, we are at the end of this book. We have one more chapter to go. Chapter 19 of book 4 consists of about 18 handwritten lines in the original language. Unfortunately, no parts of this chapter has been translated into English by the Baha'i World Center, nor any parts of it has been discussed and quoted by Dr. Saidi in this book. For your benefit, all I say that in the midst of this chapter, the Bab speaks about the love of children. It's a very special. I found that the Bab, just out of the blue, he talks about the love of children. He writes, God hath commanded parents to show the utmost love towards their children, for he hath constituted this love to be the same as love for him. He hath also ordained that all children should show the utmost courtesy and respect towards their fathers and mothers and other relatives, that their hearts may not become sorrowful. I thought that was a beautiful passage. I myself have 3 kids. So the love we give our children constitutes, according to the Bab, to be the same as the love of God. This concludes book 4, friends.